Part 1. The Backward Metronome. Warm greetings, English explorers. For more cinematic English stories that build confidence, viewers are invited to subscribe and stay close. Tonight's hook is simple and sharp. A broken violin string, a letter with no return address, and a metronome that counts backward. Mila stands at her window as Kiev slips from gold to graphite. The power flickers, the city inhales, and the night finally clicks into place. On her desk waits the letter, pale as winter bread. It arrived at dusk, carried by a quiet courier who knew her name but not his own route, as if the street itself had whispered directions into his ear. Mila turns the envelope over. No stamp, no sender, only her name in blue ink. Careful handwriting, like music walking on tiptoe. She thinks about the conservatory audition she failed that morning, the way her bow trembled, the way her heart used every rib as a drum. Stage fright, the judges said politely. Come back in a year. Outside, a tram sighs along the rails. Inside, her metronome waits, patient as a lighthouse. It is her grandfather's metronome, carved from walnut, older than most promises. It has always kept her honest, one steady tick for every thought. Tonight, though, when she winds it, the needle leans and begins to count not forward, but backward. Tick-tock, tick, like footsteps retreating down a hallway. She laughs once, a small sound that tries to be brave and fails. Then she opens the letter. A single sheet slides out, carrying a smell of iron and rain. Play the piece you fear. It reads in Ukrainian, and follow each rest as if it were a road. Beneath the sentence lies a drawn map of silence. Empty bars, rest instead of notes, arrows swimming through white space. At the bottom sits a signature that is not a name but a symbol, a tiny compass rose whose north points to nothing she recognizes. Her grandfather used to say that every city has two maps, one of streets and one of pauses. He had fixed watches in Podle for 30 years, listening to other people's seconds and teaching hers to behave. When he died last spring, time in her room became a loose thread. She pulled it and days unraveled. Now the metronome ticks backward as if trying to rewind to when he was still humming, still tapping the table, still saying, "Courage is a habit, not a visitor." Mila sets the letter on the music stand and raises her violin. The A string is new. The old one snapped during the audition, a bright scream followed by a louder silence. She breathes. She places her fingers where the notes should be, but she follows a map of rest instead, moving through the empty bars like a traveler who trusts unlit roads. The bow floats. The room holds its breath. Between the ticks of the backward metronome, something opens, a small door behind her ribs. From the courtyard comes the soft roll of wheels. She stops playing and leans to the window. A figure in a dark coat looks up just once, then slips into the shadows by the gate. He leaves behind a second envelope on the bench under the chestnut tree. The moon pulls silver from paper. Mila's pulse answers with a drum roll she cannot control. She lowers the violin. The backward ticking grows louder. Somewhere, a tram bell rings like a question. She understands that the night has made her an offer. Stay with a familiar defeat, or step onto a map that does not show streets at all, only pauses that promise to break and become music. Part 2, the second envelope. The night deepened, heavy with the hush of unanswered questions. Mila pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped into the courtyard. The chestnut tree stood tall, its branches shivering in the wind. On the bench beneath it, the second envelope waited like an orphan thought. She touched it with careful fingers, half expecting it to vanish, half fearing it might breathe. The paper was darker this time, gray as ash. When she tore it open, she found not words but a single page of sheet music. Notes scattered across the staves, some sharp, some blurred, as though smudged by rain. In the corner rested the same compass rose, but now its north pointed toward the west. Her eyes widened. The melody was one she knew, her grandfather's unfinished composition. He had worked on it through winters, his hands trembling, muttering, "It will outlive me." After his death, she searched everywhere, but the final pages were missing. And now, here it was incomplete but breathing, placed in her hands by someone who knew too much. The backward metronome ticked louder, insisting. Mila lifted her violin again. She played the opening measures, her bow shivering across the strings. At first, the sound faltered, tangled with memory and doubt. But then the notes began to weave together, fragile threads forming a tapestry she thought she had lost forever. In the silence between the bars, something stirred. The air shimmered, as if the music bent time itself. Shadows along the walls stretched into shapes, dancers, perhaps, or memories given legs. One figure lingered longer than the rest, tall, stooped, with kind eyes hidden beneath thick brows. Her grandfather, or the ghost of what she longed to see. Milla, the whisper came, not from her memory but from the dark beyond the gate. She froze. The figure from earlier, the man in the coat, stepped forward. Moonlight caught his face just enough to show lines carved by years, but not enough to reveal his eyes. He carried no lantern, only a cane capped with brass. "You play the rest," he said softly. "Good. Most people fear silence, but silence is a door." Her hands shook around the violin. "Who are you?" "Someone who owes your grandfather a promise," the man replied. He tapped the ground with his cane. "He asked me to guide you when the music returned. And now it has." Milla wanted to ask more, but before she could speak, the man placed another folded sheet upon the bench. "Tomorrow," he said, "follow the pauses, not the notes. They will lead you." Then, as if stitched into the night itself, he vanished into the alley, his cane tapping like a fading heartbeat. Milla clutched the sheet. Her pulse thundered, louder than any orchestra. Around her, the backward metronome kept time, pulling her into a story that began long before she was born. The city was asleep, but for her, dawn had already started its march. Part 3, The Hidden Measure. Dawn rose pale and reluctant, as though the sun itself doubted the day. Milla had not slept. The second sheet lay unfolded on her desk, its ink sharp, its silence is sharper. Unlike the first, this page contained only fragments, single notes separated by wide, aching pauses. Between them, arrows curved like trails on an invisible map. She studied it as her grandfather once taught her to study clocks. Not only the hands, Milla. Look at the spaces between them. Time is not the tick, it's the waiting. The backward metronome ticked, urging her. She set the violin under her chin. She played the lonely notes, letting the rest swell into something larger than sound. Each pause stretched longer than seemed possible, until she felt her chest tighten with the weight of silence. And then, on the third long rest, the window trembled. From the courtyard rose a faint vibration, not noise but resonance, as if the air itself hummed back to her. She lowered the bow. The silence beyond her walls had shifted, like a door unlocking on its own. She hurried outside. The chestnut tree stood still, but beneath it, in the dirt, a chalk mark had appeared, a single bar of music, drawn with hurried hand, pointing toward the tram tracks. Her heart drummed. She wrapped her violin carefully in cloth and followed. The streets of Kiev were half empty, the city yawning into morning, trams grown awake, iron wheels hissing sparks. She walked past shuttered shops and walls layered with posters, some torn, some defiant, some whispering protests in fading ink. At every corner she expected the man with the cane, but he did not appear. Only the chalk returned again and again, small bars of music scrawled on stones, benches, even lampposts. Always rests, never notes. Always pointing forward. At last, the trail ended at an old building near Podol, its windows blind with dust. Milla recognized it instantly. Her grandfather's workshop. The city had locked it after his death, claiming unpaid rent, sealing the door with iron bolts. She had not returned since the funeral. Yet the bolts were gone. The door hung ajar. She pushed it open. The smell of oil and wood rushed at her, sharp, familiar, like a hand pulling her back through time. Watches lay scattered on the tables, their faces dull, their hands frozen mid-second. The old metronome's twin sat on the shelf, identical to hers but unwound, its pendulum bent like a broken wing. And on the far workbench, lit by a blade of sunlight, waited a third envelope. Her fingers hovered above it. The room seemed to breathe with her. She opened it. Inside was not paper, but a small brass key, cool and heavy, tied with a strip of her grandfather's old shirt. Around its loop, a single word was scratched: courage. The backward ticking in her chest grew louder, though no metronome moved. And in that moment, she understood this was not only music. It was inheritance, unfinished, waiting for her to choose whether silence would remain silence or whether she would play it into something no one else could hear. Part 4, The Key of Silence. The brass key glinted like a captive sun in her palm. Mila turned it over and over, as if it might whisper instructions. Around her, the workshop sat still, a museum of half-repaired clocks and memories that had refused to leave. Dust floated like muted snow in the light. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon rustled, then stilled again. Her grandfather's bench felt alive beneath her hands. She remembered him bent over these tables, magnifier strapped to one eye, muttering about springs and seconds, always saying, "Every broken thing can be tuned, Mila, if you listen long enough." She slid the key into her pocket and began to search. Drawers yielded nothing but screws and yellow paper. Cupboard side opened to reveal cracked glass, tin boxes, tiny gears like lost constellations. Yet on the wall, hidden behind a cloth, she discovered a wooden case. It was carved with the same compass rose symbol from the letters. Her breath caught. The key fit. Inside lay sheet music, dozens of pages, carefully stacked, wrapped in faded velvet. The unfinished composition, whole at last, but something was strange. The notes were reversed, as if written for a mirror. She held the first page up to the light, and in its reflection, the melody shifted into clarity. The rest were still there, long and deliberate, shaping the silence as fiercely as the sound. Her fingers tingled. She placed the sheets on the stand, tuned her violin, and began. The first measures flowed with eerie familiarity. The ghost of her grandfather's voice pressed into every phrase. But as she reached the middle, the rest grew longer, until whole bars stretched into silence. She followed anyway, her bow suspended in air, her breath the only sound. Then it happened. The clocks on the shelves shivered. Their hands lurched. One by one, they began to tick not forward but backward, echoing the metronome in her room. The workshop filled with a strange chorus of reversed time. Mila's bow slipped. She lowered the violin. And in the far corner, where the dust lay thickest, the man with the cane appeared again. He leaned against the wall as if he had always been there. "You opened it," he said, his voice both weary and sharp. "Good. But courage is not the key alone. Courage is how you play what terrifies you." Mila tightened her grip on the violin. "Who are you to leave these for me? To drag me into this?" The man stepped closer. For the first time, she saw his eyes, dark, tired, but carrying the same stubborn light she had seen in her grandfather's gaze. "Your grandfather and I began this work together. He believed music could mend what time had broken, but he died before it was finished. Now the silence hunts for you. Either you face it, or it will swallow what he left behind." "What silence?" she demanded. He tapped his cane once, and the workshop lights flickered. The ticking stopped. The room sank into a hush so deep it felt alive, pressing against her skin. The kind of silence that does not comfort but devours. "That silence," he murmured. "It waits in every pause. And only you can decide whether to turn it into music or let it erase you." Her throat closed. The violin felt heavier than steel. The key burned warm in her pocket. And for the first time since the letters began arriving, Mila wondered whether she had been chosen or trapped. Part 5, The Silence Hunts. The workshop air thickened, heavy as velvet curtains. The silence the man summoned did not fade. It pressed harder, wrapping around the clocks, smothering their ticks, swallowing even the sound of her own heartbeat. Mila raised her hand to her chest in panic. Nothing. No thrum, no pulse, only emptiness where life should echo. The man with the cane stood calm in the suffocating quiet. "Do you feel it now?" His words were the only thing that pierced through, sharp as a nail. "This is a silence that waits in every pause. Your grandfather feared it once, too, but he learned what it truly is, a question, and every musician must answer it." Mila's voice cracked when she forced it out. "What if I can't?" "Then it will claim you." he said simply. The silence shifted, breathing like an unseen beast. Shadows on the walls stretched into crooked shapes, their edges trembling. Mila's violin trembled in her grip. Instinct screamed at her to run, but the man shook his head. "Play," he commanded. "Not the notes. The rest." Her hand shook violently, but she lifted the bow. She placed it lightly across the string, letting the metronome of memory guide her. Tick-tock, backward steps into the void. She dragged the bow in silence, moving without sound, and something astonishing happened. Her heartbeat returned, syncing with the gesture. Weak at first, then stronger. The shadows recoiled. The silence flinched. Again, the man said. She followed another rest, then another. Each bow stroke cut a line of defiance across the hush. Slowly, faint tones began to surface, notes not written on the page, but drawn out from absence itself. They sounded fragile, luminous, like glass struck by moonlight. The silence roared back, furious now. The workshop trembled. Tools clattered. Dust exploded from rafters. Mila stumbled, but did not stop. She pulled sound from the void, filling it with trembling music, until the air quivered with both terror and beauty. Then, without warning, the cane struck the floor. Crack! The silence shattered. Clocks coughed into motion. Pendulum swinging forward again. Mila collapsed to her knees, bow slipping from her hand. Her lungs burned. She could hear again, the clatter of tools settling, her own gasps, the faint creak of the chestnut tree outside. The man's face was pale with effort, yet his eyes carried something fierce. "Good," he said hoarsely. "You did not run. That is the first answer." Mila pressed the violin to her chest, too shaken to speak. The man leaned heavily on his cane, moving toward the door. "There will be other silences," he warned. "Stronger, hungrier. You must be ready." He paused in the doorway, half shadow, half light. "Your grandfather believed the final composition could tame them. Whether he was right." His gaze fixed on her, sharp as a blade. "Depends on you." Then he was gone. Mila sat alone in the workshop, surrounded by ticking clocks. The brass key throbbed with warmth against her leg. She understood now. This was not a mystery she could walk away from. The silence knew her name, and it would not stop hunting. Part 6. The River Pauses. Mila did not return home that night. Instead, she slept curled on the workshop floor, her grandfather's velvet-wrapped sheets beneath her head, the clocks keeping fractured guard around her. Dreams came in broken fragments. Her grandfather's voice humming, the compass rose spinning without direction, the silence stretching its hands wider than the sky. By dawn she rose, stiff and hollow-eyed. The brass key was warm in her palm, pulsing faintly as though it carried a second heartbeat. She slipped it into her pocket, packed the mirrored sheet music, and stepped outside. The man with the cane was nowhere to be seen. Yet across the cobblestones, fresh chalk bars waited, pointing not toward Pottle this time, but down to the river. Kiev's Dnipro shimmered pale under the early sun, the water moving slow, heavy, endless. On the embankment, another symbol awaited her, drawn into the dust with something sharp. The compass rose, but here its north arrow pointed straight into the water. Her pulse raced. "You want me to drown?" she whispered bitterly. But she remembered his warning. Every silence would return stronger. Perhaps the river held the next test. She opened the sheet music. Near the bottom of the page she had not yet played, a phrase curved upward in long arcs, ending not in a note but in a series of rests that stretched across the staves like stepping stones. A bridge made of pauses. She lifted her violin. Passers-by glanced curiously, but most ignored her, hurrying to trams or markets. Mila placed her bow to the strings and began to play, not the notes, but the rests, shaping silence into rhythm. The river answered. Waves slowed. The air thickened, carrying her bow's movement forward as if invisible strings pulled the entire river into the music. One by one, the rests seemed to extend across the water, glowing faintly like silver stones just beneath the surface. She gasped. The river was giving her a path. Her knees shook, yet the brass key grew warmer, urging her forward. She slung the violin across her back, tightened her shawl, and stepped onto the first glowing rest. It held. The second, then the third. Each silence bore her weight, like a bridge woven from her grandfather's unfinished song. Halfway across, the air shifted. The silence returned, thicker, vaster than before. The glowing rest flickered. The water beneath churned black. From its depths rose shapes of drowned voices. Faces half-formed, eyes wide with mute hunger. They clawed upward, dragging silence with them. Mila stumbled. The bridge trembled. She clutched her violin, bow shaking in her hand. And then she remembered the silence was a question. She must answer it. With trembling breath, she lifted her bow and drew sound from the void. Long, aching tones poured into the air, fragile but defiant. The drowned voices recoiled, hissing back into the depths. The rest brightened again, steady beneath her feet. Step by step, silence and sound battled around her, until at last her boots touched the far shore. The glowing bridge dissolved into ripples. The silence retreated, murmuring like a threat. Mila fell to her knees, soaked in sweat, clutching her violin. She had crossed. She had survived. On the stone steps ahead, another envelope waited, sealed in wax with the compass rose. Part 7, the compass turns. The envelope was heavier than the last, its wax seal pressed deep as if to keep something desperate inside. Mila broke it open with trembling fingers. A folded map slid out, drawn on parchment so old it smelled of smoke. At its center lay the familiar compass rose, but this time its arrow spun outward wildly, pointing not in 4 directions, but in dozens, tangled like threads of storm. Across the edges, written in her grandfather's hand, were words that struck like a bell. Silence is not an enemy, Mila. It is a gate. To pass, you must play what you cannot bear play. Her chest tightened. She knew what that meant. The audition piece. The one she had abandoned after the string snapped, after fear drowned her in shame. To face it now felt like reopening a wound that had never scarred. The map quivered in her hands, lines shifting until they revealed a single destination. The abandoned opera house near Andreevsky Descent. Once a cathedral of music, now a hollow ruin swallowed by ivy and dust. She walked there as evening fell, the brass key burning steady against her ribs. The streets grew quieter, lamps flickering awake. By the time she reached the opera house, the city had folded into shadows. The great doors groaned open at her touch. Inside, moonlight spilled to a shattered dome, silvering rows of empty seats. On the stage stood only a single chair and music stand, waiting like a challenge. Mila approached slowly, her footsteps echoing. She set the violin in place, placed the mirrored sheet music on the stand, and wound her grandfather's metronome. It began to tick backward, each swing louder than the last. Her bow hovered, her breath faltered, and then darkness thickened. The silence had arrived. It spilled from the corners, swallowing the opera house seat by seat, until every shadow leaned forward, listening. The air froze. Mila's heartbeat staggered. Her hands nearly dropped the violin. Then, from the balcony, a single cane tapped once against the railing. The man stood there, half hidden in shadow. "Play," he commanded. Her bow touched the string. The first notes cracked with fear. The rests loomed like chasms, threatening to swallow her whole. She closed her eyes. The silence surged forward, wrapping around her throat, around her chest, whispering a failure. But then memory rose. Her grandfather's laugh, low and patient, his hand steady on hers, saying, "Courage is not waiting for fear to leave. Courage is bowing while fear listens." She struck the next note harder. Then another. Then another. The opera house shook. Shadows writhed. The silence howled. But her music grew, fragile, desperate, unstoppable. She poured every failure, every shame, every lonely night into the melody. The rest no longer devoured her. She filled them with sound that was hers alone. And for a moment, the silence bent. It did not vanish, but bowed. When the final note hung trembling in the dome, the backward metronome stilled. Mila lowered her bow, sweat streaking her face, tears on her cheeks. The man with the cane descended slowly, his footsteps echoing. He stopped at the edge of the stage. For the first time, his voice softened. "You answered," he said. "Not perfectly, But truly, that is enough. From his coat, he drew a final object, a pocket watch, its glass cracked, its hands frozen at midnight. He placed it on the stand beside her music. Your grandfather's last gift. Tomorrow, the compass will point for the last time. Be ready. The shadows lifted. The silence withdrew. The opera house exhaled, broken but alive. Mila stood alone, clutching the cracked watch, knowing the final test was near. Part 8, the last rest. Dawn bled into Kiev like ink into water, slow and uncertain. Mila walked with the cracked watch heavy in her pocket. The brass key pressed warm against her skin. The mirrored music clutched beneath her arm. Every step echoed with the man's words. Tomorrow, the compass will point for the last time. And it did. On the street before her home, chalk lines waited once more, but not a trail this time. A single compass rose, drawn with meticulous hand, its north pointing upward, not at any street, but to the sky. She followed it to the chestnut tree. There, nailed into its bark, was a final sheet of music. Her grandfather's handwriting trembled across the staves, as though written on the very day he died. At the bottom, beneath the last bar, just one word was scrawled. Play. The opera house had been test. The river had been trial. This was a reckoning. Mila carried her violin to St. Andrew's Hill, where the city stretched below like a vast, listening audience. She set the mirrored sheet on her stand. The backward metronome ticked in her memory, louder, faster. The cracked watch in her pocket pulsed like a second heart. She raised her bow. The silence came at once. Not a creeping hush, but an avalanche, rolling down from the sky, devouring sound, color, breath. Buildings blurred. The wind itself folded inward. The world became a page of rest, endless, merciless. Mila's knees buckled. Her lungs screamed for air that would not come. But she remembered, silence is not an enemy. It is a gate. She dragged her bow. One note split the hush, trembling, fragile, but alive. Another followed. Then a rest, long as eternity. The silence pressed close, waiting to consume her. She filled it with sound. Again, and then the composition unfolded. Not just her grandfather's, but hers. Notes poured out like rivers. Each rest a stone she dared to step upon. The air shimmered. Shadows bent. The silence roared but did not win. Instead, it shifted, reshaped, softened into something vast and tender, as though it had never wanted to devour her at all, only to be given voice. The final bar approached. Mila's arms trembled with exhaustion. She lifted the bow one last time, struck the note, and let it dissolve into the longest rest of all. The world held its breath. Then, bells rang from every church tower. Clocks across the city stuttered, then swung forward. The cracked watch in her pocket ticked once, twice, then steadied, alive again. The silence lifted, not gone but transformed, woven into the music of the living city. Mila lowered her violin. Her tears fell freely, but her hands no longer shook. On the hill's edge, the man with the cane stood waiting. His face was softer now, a weight lifted. He bowed once, deeply. Your grandfather's work is complete, and so is yours. The silence will never hunt you again. It will play with you. She blinked, and he was gone. Only the city remained, breathing, alive, full of ticking, chiming, murmuring life. Mila stood among it, violin in hand, knowing she had not just played music. She had learned to turn fear into song. And when the wind carried her melody down the hill, people paused, listening. They did not know her name, but they felt something awaken. Silence had become music, and music had become courage. Glowing Star, thank you for staying with this story through all 8 parts. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts. Here's a question for you. Do you think silence is more frightening or more powerful? Share your answer in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.